introduce to you Senator Lee, our speaker today. Senator Lee and Sharon Lee are tireless advocates for faith, family, and freedom. A former federal prosecutor and appellate litigator who previously worked as a law clerk to Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito Jr., Senator Lee serves on the Judiciary Committee, the Commerce Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Joint Economic Committee. He is also the chairman of the Senate Steering Committee. In addition to his book, Written Out of History, his other books include Our Lost Constitution and The Freedom Agenda. Senator Lee and his wife Sharon are the parents of 3 children, James, John, and Eliza, all of whom attended American Heritage prior to Senator Lee's election in the year 2010. Our Lost Constitution, a book that Senator Lee wrote and I used in my 11th grade class last year as a textbook, reflects the senator's knowledge of the origins of the U.S. Constitution, its purpose in our nation's well-being and our future. He talks in the book about our ongoing challenges to the Constitution by those sworn to uphold it. Senator Lee goes on to tell us how we as citizens can take matters into our own hands to help preserve the great purpose of this remarkable document. Benjamin Franklin once said that if you want to be remembered to history, you should do something worth the writing or write something worth the reading. And I think in Senator Lee we have an individual that may very well in the future fit into both of these categories. You'll be a man that will do things that will be remembered and be written about, and also writes things worth the reading. So it's my great privilege to introduce to you Senator Lee, and you're in for a real treat.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. This is one of my favorite places on the planet. As Mr. Cornell mentioned, all 3 of my children, James, John, and Eliza, attended this school. My wife Sharon also attended American Heritage back when it was in the old building. And this is a beautiful place. I remember 12, 13, 14 years ago one morning, it was Thanksgiving Day. My family and I lived in Cedar Hills at the time, just up the hill. And we had a house full of people in town for Thanksgiving. Any of you know what that's like to have lots of relatives in from out of town. And I knew that it was the only quiet moment I was going to enjoy all day or for the rest of the week. So I went on a run that morning, and I ran past American Heritage, and I looked into the school, and I saw the statue that you have in the lobby, in the entryway, of several of our founding fathers kneeling in prayer. And I just had this overwhelming feeling on that Thanksgiving morning of how much thanks I feel for this school, for those who teach here, and for the principles that it embraces. It truly is an honor to be here. All 3 of my children also had Mr. Cornell as their teacher, and they absolutely loved him. I still remember when I picked up my sons James and John, they're twins, on their last day of 5th grade. My son James, who's a big, tough guy, or fancies himself as that, actually cried when he got in the car on his last day of 5th grade, just because he was going to miss having Mr. Cornell. And it was a wonderful experience. So I've been in the United States Senate now for about 6.5 years. It's been an interesting time. I was elected for the first time in 2010. I was 39 years old, and at the time I was the youngest member of the United States Senate, and I felt like I kind of didn't fit in. Has anybody here ever felt like you didn't fit in? You don't have to raise your hand, but think about it if you have. Everybody feels that from time to time. I certainly did then. And I tried to fit in by telling people, even though I'm only 39, I can read at the level of a 40-year-old, and they weren't that impressed. And to make matters worse, sometimes when I went to the Senate to vote, we have to go to a specific place inside the U.S. Capitol in order to vote. And they call a roll, sort of like they do in class. And they start at the top of the alphabet, and they work their way through. And the way you vote is you say yes or no. It's usually aye or nay. I don't know why we say it like that, but that's just the old tradition of the Senate. But to get in there, you have to walk past these very heavily armed police, these very heavily armed guards. And when I first got there, they didn't think I looked like a senator, and they would look at me with this stare that kind of said, hey, you're not a senator, go over there. That's where the people who aren't senators go. And I had to figure out a way to have them let me inside the Senate. And they did not want to see my driver's license. I had to prove to them who I was. So let me see if I've got the card here. I had to show them my official Senate ID. And it has my picture on it, and it has my name on it. It says I'm a United States Senator representing Utah. And then the original card, the one that I had then, said expiration January 3rd, 2017. I had to tell Sharon and James and John and Eliza that that was not the date when I would personally expire, just my term of office. And these guards would sit there and look at it to make sure that it wasn't fake, to make sure it was real, and then they'd look at each other, they'd shrug their shoulders, and they'd say, I guess we have to let him in. And this went on all the time. Until finally I mentioned to one of my fellow senators, what do I do to stop, having to show them my ID every time? And they said, okay, they gave you a lapel pin when you were sworn in. Do you still have that? And I said, yes, but I'm not really into jewelry and accessories. I put that in my desk drawer, and I closed the drawer, and I forgot all about it. He said, okay, put it on, because that pin is worn only by senators, and then the police will recognize you, and they'll let you in. And he was right. I put it on, and it worked almost every single time. I became so fond of the pin that I wear it now all the time, every time I'm in Washington, and I've even named it. I call it my Sorry Senator pin. Because if the police don't recognize me and they ask for my ID, I just point to the pin. And then they say, oh, sorry, Senator, you can come in. And most of the time, this works really well. It works like a charm. It doesn't fail, hardly ever, except every once in a while it does. One time after I had been in the Senate for quite a while, I was on the Senate floor, and I had one arm resting on the desk in front of me. I was thinking about how the vote was going to turn out. And one of the non-uniformed security guys came up to me and said, excuse me, sir, will you please not lean on the senator's desk? And I said, oh, I'm terribly sorry. See, they're very protective of the desks. And I was afraid he was accusing me of leaning on the desk, thereby damaging it. You see, a lot of the desks in there are original equipment, meaning they were built in about 1860 when that part of the Capitol was finished, which means that they are almost as old as some of the guys I work with in the Senate. And so they're really protective of these desks. But he proceeded to question me more. He said, are you with the minority, meaning the minority party, which was the Republican Party at the time? And I said, well, yes. What do you mean, on this vote or the next? I'm a member of the minority party. He said, are you with the minority leader? And I said, well, Mitch McConnell is our minority leader. I don't know what you mean. And he said, oh, are you part of the minority leader's staff? And then I realized, oh, he doesn't know who I am. That's why the harsh treatment. And so I just pointed to the pin. And all it got me was a blank stare. And so I realized I was going to have to do something that I didn't like to do, especially then. I still don't like to do it now. I was going to have to use my title. I don't like having to use my title. It makes me feel funny. And so I kind of mumbled it. I said, I'm Senator Lee. What? Okay. My name is Mike Lee. I represent a state called Utah. It's sort of squarish. It resembles a chair. It's in the Rocky Mountains. We have lovely skiing, best snow on earth. And then and only then did he realize who I was, and all the color seemed to drain from his face as he told me in one hurried breath, I'm terribly sorry for this misunderstanding. My name is Steve, if you want to report me. And then Steve ran for the door. I chased after Steve because I felt bad for him. I mean, this was an honest mistake, and I didn't want him to beat himself up over it. So I chased after him, but Steve was way too fast. And but from then on, every time I saw Steve in the hallway, I would stop and I'd say hi to him. I'd shake his hand and I'd say, hi, Steve, how are you? Just so Steve knew there were no hard feelings. Then only recently did it occur to me, his name's probably not Steve. For all I know, his name's Bob. Steve's maybe a guy he works with who he doesn't like. But had I not used my title that day, which I didn't want to have to do because it made me uncomfortable, it required me to get outside of my comfort zone, I might have been pulled out of the Senate before I could vote. The 3 million people I represented in Utah would not have had me representing them as a result. I would have lost something. They would have lost something. It would have taken a while to get it cleared out, I'm sure. I can't very well reach my ID in handcuffs, if I were in that position. So I would have lost something. I had to assert my right to be there. And that story isn't unique to United States senators. It is not unique to public officials, to those who hold elected office or any other type of public office. This is something that we should all remember, that in order to live in a land where we benefit from the protections of the U.S. Constitution, we often have to assert that which is rightfully ours, even when, especially when, it's difficult. Sometimes, under the Constitution, there's something that is sufficiently well understood and established and respected that you don't really have to worry about it as much. For example, the police are not going to come to your house and make sure that you go to the church that the police want you to go to. By the way, if that ever happens, please call me immediately. They can't do that. But that's not going to happen, because in this country, we understand that people have the ability to worship where, when, how, or what they choose. It's protected by the Constitution, and most of us, right now at least, follow that. So for the time being, that part's probably not going to be an issue. But there are a lot of other aspects of the Constitution that have become neglected, forgotten, written out of history, you might say, to the point where it's becoming far more difficult for us to say that all of our rights are really still intact. Especially what I regard as perhaps the most important feature of the Constitution. You have to remember, the whole reason why we have a Constitution in the first place is to protect us from the bad things that inevitably happen when a few people get a whole lot of power. You see, we have learned as human beings through sad experience that when any one person or group of people will grow to acquire too much power, that person or that group of people will start to exercise unrighteous dominion, will start to abuse that power, to mistreat others. Our founding fathers understood that. You see, they were wise men raised up by Almighty God, even the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to that very purpose, to write that very document. And they understood human nature. They understood that we as human beings are redeemable, but we're flawed. We make mistakes. And particularly if you give power to a human, there's a risk that unless that power is checked, unless it's limited in some way, they're going to use that power to abuse others. They put in place a document that protects freedom, that protects the dignity of the human soul in several ways. First, it splits up power along two axes. One, the vertical axis, and the other, the horizontal axis. Those are fancy words for a simple concept. The vertical protection of power is one that we call federalism. That, too, is a big word that describes a simple concept, which says, under the Constitution, most power in most parts of government is to be exercised within the state government and within the governments of the subdivisions of the states. I'm talking about cities, towns, counties, and so forth. That's where most powers are. Most laws that affect your day-to-day existence are and are supposed to be made and enforced at the state and local level. The Founding Fathers understood that in order for us to exist, to survive, to thrive as a nation, we would have to have some laws that would be national in nature, but that most powers would be local and state in nature. They came up with a list. Among the list of powers that would be national would be the power to provide for our national defense, to declare war, to come up with a uniform system of weights and measures, to protect trademarks, copyrights, and patents, to coin money and regulate the value thereof, the power to regulate trade or commerce between the states and with foreign nations, people trading things. And then there's my favorite power of Congress, the one that we don't talk about very much. It's called the power to grant letters of marque and reprisal. Marque there is spelled M-A-R-Q-U-E. If you spell it out for your parents, they'll be very impressed. A letter of marque and reprisal is basically a hall pass, which is appropriate given that we're in a school right now. It's a hall pass issued by Congress that allows the person holding it to be a pirate in the name of the United States government. Now, I don't know how long I will be privileged to serve in the United States Senate, but one day I'm going to get a letter of marque and reprisal. I'm going to be a pirate. I'm going to get a flag with the skull and crossbones on it. It's going to be a lot of fun. You're all invited to join me. Glad to know you're on board. The point is that in that list of powers, you will not find a power in Congress, a power that gives Washington, D.C., our nation's capital, our federal government, the power to do anything and everything it wants, the power to make everything fair, the power to decide where you go to the doctor and how to pay for it. No, the powers of the federal government are, as James Madison described them, few and defined, and those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. I tell a story about where this principle came from in my book, Written Out of History. By the way, in this book, I try to tell history in a little bit different way. I try to tell it in a way that's more along the lines of how I would have preferred to learn history, through stories. When all you learn through history is a list of facts and figures, it gets boring, it gets dull. You might as well be reading the phone book, and most of you are thinking, what's a phone book? But it's not fun. But if you tell a story behind it, you learn something from it. And just as importantly, an important part of any individual or family or community or nation is the story of that individual or family or community or nation. If you lose track of what your story is, you lose track of who you are and where you're going, where you've been and what that says about where you want to go. I tell the stories of a handful of forgotten founders, some of whom were fathers and some of whom were mothers, who had a profound impact on the American founding, but whose stories we've forgotten. One of the stories I tell in here is of a man named Canasatego. Anybody here ever heard of Canasatego? Most people, I'm glad to know that a few haven't, not surprised to hear that most haven't. Canasatego was an Iroquois Indian chief, a member of the Onondaga tribe, who taught Benjamin Franklin about the principle that we now call federalism, this vertical protection I just described that keeps most of the power close to the people where it belongs. There are a lot of features of our government that we inherited in one way or another, that we learned about from the English. This was not one of them. The English didn't have federalism, at least not like this. This was much more of an American principle. One would say a Native American principle than it was an English principle. You see, Benjamin Franklin and Canasatego met at a conference in Albany, New York in 1744. And at that point, they established a relationship, one that taught Benjamin Franklin about this idea that had helped the Iroquois Confederacy to thrive. See, these different tribes came together and they said, we're going to govern ourselves nationally as one group for purposes that are related to our status as a nation. And in other words, in order to protect ourselves from those on the outside of our nation who would harm us. But we will retain, each tribe, the right to govern itself. He showed Benjamin Franklin a quiver of arrows. And he said, these arrows are stronger when they're together than when they are separate. You can do that with a stack of toothpicks if you don't have a bow and arrow at home. And you wind those things together, you glue them together, put them together with rubber bands. You will not be able to break a stack of 50 toothpicks. Each toothpick you can break with one hand easily, but together you can't break them because they become stronger. This is the concept of e pluribus unum, out of many one. But the Iroquois Confederacy, and Canasatego in particular, understood that a key part of this is that each tribe had to still be able to govern itself internally for its own purposes. That was taught to Benjamin Franklin by Canasatego. Benjamin Franklin shared that with the other founding fathers. That eventually made its way into our Constitution, into the Articles of Confederation first, but that didn't work. It led to the Constitution. That's a different story altogether. One of the reasons why we've forgotten about Canasatego has to do with the fact that we've forgotten about federalism. We don't talk about it anymore. We don't assert it anymore, even though it is as important to liberty, I believe, as any other protection in the Constitution. It's not because states always make right decisions. They don't. They make mistakes too because they're run by fallible, mortal human beings just like other governments, but they're closer to you. You can turn them around faster. You can change them faster, and that makes a difference. We've got to restore the story of Canasatego, and with it, the principle of federalism. The other protection in the Constitution that I mentioned that's been neglected, that's been forgotten, is this horizontal protection that we call separation of powers. That's the one that says that within Washington, D.C., you know, there are a few powers reserved for our national government, our federal government. Of those powers, they have to be exercised in a certain way. We're going to have one branch, the legislative branch, where I work, Congress, that has the power to make law. We're going to have another branch, the executive branch, headed by the president, that has the power to enforce the law. We'll have a third branch, headed by the Supreme Court, that has the power to interpret the law. When those functions are split up in this way, no one person or group of people can become too powerful as to jeopardize the rights of the people. This, too, is important. And this, too, has a forgotten founder, several actually, but one in particular I'm going to refer to today, who was its champion. Mercy Otis Warren was a playwright, a polemicist, a public commentator. He was also a protege and friend of John Adams at the time of the Revolution. She was a writer who commonly expressed her public opinions on all sorts of things. And at the time the Constitution was being written, and after it had been written, before it had been ratified by the states, Mercy Otis Warren stood up. She embraced a principle that has not been appreciated by history as much. She spoke out against the Constitution. She warned of against its ratification. Now, to be clear, I'm glad the Constitution was ratified. It should have been ratified. It was the right thing to do. But Mercy Otis Warren raised some valid points that, had they been listened to more carefully, could have allowed us to stick to the Constitution more faithfully. Let me explain what I mean. At the time the Constitution was being debated and we were deciding whether or not we would ratify it, Mercy Otis Warren pointed out, look, there is a real risk here that in the end you could end up having presidents who think they're lawmakers, presidents who are in charge of enforcing the law, actually making the law. You could end up with lawmakers who think their job is to execute the law. You could end up blending the judicial power with the executive power or the legislative power. You could end up blending the executive power with the lawmaking power. That, the Founding Fathers understood, was one of the greatest threats to liberty ever, because if you have the same person or same group of people making the law and enforcing it at the same time, then they're going to be making it up as they go along. Let me explain what I mean by this in terms that might make more sense to young students, particularly for you younger students. When you're out at recess, you still have recess here, right? Or, okay, PE. Some type of physical activity during the day. When you're playing a game, let's say if one of your friends starts making up the rules as he goes along, and he arbitrarily changes the rules just so that he can win every time. That's unfair, right? That's what happens when you allow the same people to make the law as also are in charge of enforcing the law. That's what Mercy Otis Warren warned of. Now, over the last 80 years, we've seen a slow drift away from this principle of separation of powers. We've also seen a slow drift away from the other protection that I described of federalism. Let me explain what I mean. 80 years ago, most of our laws still were made at the state and local level. 80 years ago, the states spent more money on government on a combined basis than the federal government did. But over the last 80 years, both of those things have changed. For nearly 80 years, the federal government has always spent more than the combined 50 states. And most of our laws are now being made, depending on what you count as a law, depending on what you count as the economic impact of our laws, at the federal level. So we've taken power away from the people at the state and local level. We've moved it to Washington, D.C. That means people feel more removed from the laws by which they're governed. That's eroded the vertical protection of federalism. At the same time, we've eroded separation of powers. I keep 2 stacks of documents behind my desk in Washington that I'd love to show you. If you're ever in Washington, D.C., come by. Every Wednesday at 3:30, we serve Jell-O. Jell-O is Utah's official state snack, by the way. That's why we do this. For reasons I don't entirely understand, Utah consumes more Jell-O on a per capita basis than any other state in the union. True fact. So when you come by my office for Jell-O some Wednesday at 3:30 when the Senate's in session, I will show you 2 stacks of documents. One of them is a few inches tall and it's a few hundred pages long. It consists of the laws passed by Congress last year. The other stack is 13 feet tall. It's 97,000 pages long. And it consists of the laws made by executive branch bureaucrats, meaning people who work in the executive branch, in the branch of the president, whose job it is to enforce the laws. They're basically making laws. 97,000 pages just last year, what they made. Now, it's not that these are bad people. It's not that they're not hardworking or well-educated, well-intentioned, highly specialized. They're, in many cases, all of those things. But there's a problem. You can't fire them. You can fire me. You can fire me every 6 years if you live in Utah. You just missed your chance. You'll get another chance in 2022 if you want. You can fire your members of the House of Representatives every 2 years. You cannot fire government bureaucrats. And it's for that simple reason that the very first clause of the very first section of the very first article of the Constitution says that the power to make law is vested in Congress. All power to make federal law is vested in Congress. And then it goes on in Article 1, Section 7 to explain how that happens. Well, you want to know how this has happened? Why we pass a few hundred to a few thousand pages of law, and they'll pass 97,000 pages of law in a year? We have started delegating to them the power to make law. It starts out with what usually sounds like a good idea, but ends up being kind of a bad idea. It starts out with us saying, okay, let's identify a problem everybody can agree is a problem. Let's say air pollution. Everybody's worried about air pollution. They don't want to breathe dirty air. So we'll pass a law, and if it's addressing air pollution, it might say, we shall have clean air. Everybody could vote for that, right? Nobody wants dirty air. So members of Congress will vote for the law that says we shall have clean air. But then the next sentence says, and we give the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the power to make and enforce good laws to make sure we have clean air. And then the people in that agency get to make law. They don't ever stand for election, but they're making all the law. And if they make bad laws, it's very difficult to overcome that. The problem has been that members of Congress who are elected to make law don't want to do that difficult job of making the law. My point is that we can restore together this vertical protection we call federalism and the horizontal protection we call separation of powers if we remember the stories behind them. The story of Canasatego, who explained why it is that we should have something like federalism. The stories of people like Mercy Otis Warren, who warned us against what would happen if you gave too much power to any one branch or any one component within the federal government. There are other parts of the Constitution that aren't structural like this, but just tell the government what it can't do to you. And just as importantly, tell you that you are special, that you are unique, that you are free, that all human souls have dignity. And that's the story that I want to close with. The story of Mum Bet. This is one of my favorite stories in the book. Mum Bet was a slave in Massachusetts. Mum Bet and her sister Lizzie served in the home of Colonel John Ashley, who owned them as property. While Colonel John Ashley was in many respects a kind and decent man, his wife was less so. She was often very unkind. One day, Mrs. Ashley came into the kitchen where Mum and her sister Lizzie were working. And Mrs. Ashley saw that Lizzie, Mum Bet's sister, also a slave in the same household, was eating scraps off of a pan. She had been so busy cooking for Colonel Ashley and his family that she herself hadn't had any time to eat that day. So she was eating scraps out of a pan. Mrs. Ashley was angry with this. She considered this stealing, what she regarded as their food. I didn't know what she expected them to eat, but in any event, she picked up the first thing she could find, which was a small shovel that was sitting in the fire and was red hot because of the coals. She reached out to hit Lizzie with this red hot metal object. Mum Bet wouldn't have that. She was very protective of her sister. She jumped in front of Mrs. Ashley just as that happened, and instead Mrs. Ashley hit her with this searing, red-hot piece of metal. This made Mom Bet very sad. It was at about that moment when she remembered something. She remembered that many years earlier, Colonel Ashley had had over a number of gentlemen to draft a document that later became known as the Sheffield Declaration. A document said that all human beings are free and equal in a state of nature. We are all free and we are all equal. That's it. She also remembered that that same language, which had been negotiated by her master, Colonel John Ashley, with the help of some other local gentlemen, including a lawyer named Theodore Sedgwick, in the home where she served as a slave. That had later made its way into the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780, which was written by John Adams. And it may have been at that moment that she realized that's now the law of the land in Massachusetts, that all human beings are free and equal. If we're free and equal, then why should I be owned by another person? She left the Ashley residence that day and she walked down the street some distance to the law offices of Theodore Sedgwick. She knew that he understood the Sheffield Declaration and that he therefore understood the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780. And she said, if all men are free and equal in a state of nature, why can I be owned by another person? He thought about it. He did some research. And he told her, you shouldn't. They went to court without waiting for anyone else to free her. She herself decided to assert her rights, even though it was difficult, especially when it was difficult. She went into court, and she used this technique, what's called a common law right of action, called a writ of replevin, which is something that you would use when taking back something that someone had unlawfully obtained from you. If someone took something that belonged to you and they wouldn't give it back, you could go to the court and they would order them to give it back. That's what they were doing, but with a human being. And do you know what? It worked. Mom Bet became the first slave to win her freedom that way. Even though her case involved only her, it opened the door for every other slave in America eventually to obtain freedom. She did this on the basis of this constitutional principle, which is another important feature of our own Constitution, which is that it respects the dignity of the individual human soul. You see, you matter. You matter to your Father in heaven. You matter so much that he sent his only begotten Son, Jesus Christ, to come down and take on a mortal body, to suffer the pains, the afflictions, the consequences of sins for all mankind, so that you could be forgiven of your sins and one day return to your Heavenly Father. Many of our founding fathers understood this in some way or another. And that's one of the reasons why it was so important to adopt principles, not all of which were adopted in 1787, that would protect the dignity of the individual human soul. This is why it's so important that we remember that the most important feature of the Constitution is to protect the individual human soul. In other words, we like freedom, we like the Constitution, not just because they sound like nice things to do. We like them, we support them, we believe in them, we defend them because of the good things that free people do, because people deserve to be free and they deserve to become who their Father in heaven wants to allow them to become, if only they can be free. The reason why we have to put these things into constitutions is because if we don't, somewhere along the way, we'll have people who want to govern over us, who want to make themselves more powerful or more wealthy, who will take those things away from us. Sometimes in little pieces, sometimes in really, really big pieces. One of the best ways we can understand what human beings are like is to observe what they do in government. That's why James Madison explained in Federalist number 51. Remember, the Federalist Papers were these documents written in order to persuade the states to ratify the Constitution after it had been drafted. James Madison wrote Federalist number 51. He said that government is a good reflection of what human beings are, what they're like. If we as human beings were angels, we wouldn't need government at all. We wouldn't need police, we wouldn't need armies and navies, because we'd be angels and we'd be nice to each other. We'd respect the dignity of each human being around us. If we as human beings had access to angels to govern over us, we wouldn't need a constitution. But we're not angels, and we don't have access to angels, at least for the purpose of administering government. I do believe there are angels round about us, but they're not currently available to run our government. That being the case, we need a constitution. We need this Constitution. But in order for it to work, we have to know it. We have to understand it. We have to assert our rights under it. And in order for that to work, we have to know the stories behind it. We have to know something about the men and women who bled for it, who paid for it with blood, sweat, and tears, about the warnings they made in their time, some of which have been forgotten, but that need to be remembered. If we can remember their stories, we will be able more fully to assert that which is rightfully ours, the right to live in freedom, in liberty, and in lives that reflect the dignity of the immortal human soul. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be with you today.